One night, a small group of friends gathered in a cozy house at the edge of town. They were excited because it was time for their annual Thanksgiving dinner. The kitchen smelled wonderful, with the scent of roasting turkey and baking pies filling the air, and everyone was laughing and talking about memories from past celebrations. The fire in the hearth crackled, and the warm light made the room feel cheerful. But as the night went on, something felt strange, because there was a weird tension in the air, even though no one could explain it. Then, the lights in the house started to flicker, and the sound of buzzing made everyone stop talking. For a second, the room became very quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the warm glow from the oven disappeared, and the whole house went dark. Then, they heard a sound. It was a high-pitched whisper and very faint, but everyone could hear it. It sounded as though it was coming from all around them, from the walls and even from the floor. Suddenly, they felt this whispering sent chills down their spines because it didn't sound normal.
Did you hear that?
Mark asked, and his voice shook as he tried to turn on his phone flashlight. But his phone didn't work and the screen stayed black. Now everyone was silent, and the room felt heavy as if the air itself was pressing down on them. Then the whispering stopped. Suddenly, the lights came back on, and everything looked normal again. The friends looked around the room, and they were confused and nervous. They wanted to feel safe, but something didn't seem right. Then, they noticed something strange because, on the dinner table, where they had been eating, there was now a small wooden figurine. It looked like a turkey, and it was carved very carefully. The figurine was sitting right in the middle of the table, but it hadn't been there before.
Where did this come from?
Sarah whispered, and her voice was shaky. They all stared at the figurine, but none of them remembered putting it there, and none of them had even seen it before.
Maybe it is a prank,
Tom said. He tried to sound calm, but his voice didn't match his words. Someone must have put it there when the lights went out, but no one laughed because no one thought it was funny. Then they all stood there and stared at the strange wooden turkey. Now, the air in the room felt thick and cold, even though the fire was still burning in the hearth, because it was as if something invisible had entered the room and was watching them. Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be warm and happy, but now it felt different because it felt as though something dark and scary had joined them at the table. Later, the group decided to visit the local Thanksgiving festival to forget about the strange events earlier. The town's Thanksgiving festival was usually lively, with families laughing, children playing, and music filling the air. But when they drove into the center of town, something felt wrong because the streets were completely empty. Normally, the festival grounds were filled with colorful tents, music, and the smell of roasted chestnuts. But today, everything was silent. The booths were empty, the carnival rides stood still, and there was no smell of food.
This is strange,
Mark said quietly. He sounded unsure as he parked the car near the entrance. Then, the group got out and looked around, and then they saw a banner that read, "Happy Thanksgiving," but it looked old and forgotten.
That is weird,
Tom muttered. I thought the festival was today. Did we get the date wrong? Then, they decided to walk further into the festival area to see if they could find someone. Even though they felt uneasy, they hoped someone could explain why the town was so empty. As they reached the center of town, they saw an old woman sitting on a bench. She was hunched over with a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her face was wrinkled, and she wore a wide-brimmed hat. When they got closer, they saw her eyes, and her cold and sharp stare made them stop in their tracks. Then, the woman said in a raspy voice, "The harvest moon is watching. You shouldn't be here. Leave. Leave before nightfall." Then, the group exchanged nervous looks. Sarah opened her mouth to speak but stayed quiet, because the woman's words made her feel afraid, even though they didn't make much sense. As they turned to leave, the woman spoke again, her voice weak but clear. "It is too late now, because the harvest, it never forgets." A cold wind blew through the empty streets and sent chills down their spines, because the town, usually full of life, now felt like a ghost town. Then they hurried back to the car and wanted to leave quickly, but as they approached, they saw a group of hooded figures standing silently in the distance. They didn't move, but their presence made the air feel heavy and cold.
Who are they?
Sarah whispered, and her voice was shaky as she fumbled with the car keys.
I don't know,
Mark replied, and his voice was tense.
but let's get out of here. Now.
Then, the group climbed into the car and locked the doors. As Sarah started the engine, the hooded figures didn't move, and they just stood there and watching.
Did you see that?
Sarah asked. Her voice was trembling as she drove away. "Yeah," Mark said, "I saw it." The road behind them seemed longer than usual and stretched into the darkness. Even though they had left, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Back at the house, the group tried to forget the strange events. They told themselves everything was fine, but the house felt colder because the shadows seemed darker, and the silence was heavier. Sitting together in the living room, they tried talking about random things to distract themselves. Even though they tried to act normal, everyone could feel that something was wrong. Then, a faint sound broke the silence. It was like a scream, soft at first, but then it grew louder, and the scream echoed through the trees outside. Suddenly, Tom stood up quickly, and his face was pale.
Did you hear that?
He asked. Everyone nodded, and they were too scared to speak. Then, they listened again, and they heard the scream come again, but louder and more desperate. Then another scream followed, and then another.
It is coming from the woods.
Mark said, and his voice was shaking. Then, he looked out the window, but all he saw was the dark line of trees. Even though they were terrified, they knew they had to check it out. And then they grabbed flashlights and ran outside. The air was freezing cold, even though it shouldn't have been. The wind blew through the trees and made eerie sounds. As they walked deeper into the woods, the ground felt soft, like the forest was alive. After a few minutes, they reached a clearing, and in the middle was a circle of rotting pumpkins with twisted and evil faces. Their insides had spilled out in dark and sticky piles. In the center, they saw a large wooden statue of a turkey stood, and its hollow eyes were staring at them. The group froze because they felt like it was watching them. Suddenly, a loud scream filled the air. It was much closer this time, and it was so loud that they had to cover their ears. It sounded like something big and angry. Then, they saw something moving in the shadows, fast and close. The sound of snapping branches made it clear that whatever it was coming toward them.
We need to go.
Sarah shouted, and there was panic in her voice. Then, they ran as fast as they could, because the sound of heavy footsteps followed, getting closer and closer. They reached the house just in time and slammed the door behind them. They locked it quickly and stood in the dark living room because they were too scared to speak. Outside, the screams stopped suddenly, but the forest was no longer quiet because they could hear rustling leaves and snapping twigs, as if something was still out there, waiting.
What was that?
Tom whispered. No one answered, but one thing was clear. The scream wasn't just a scream of fear, because it was a warning. Something terrible was out there, and it wouldn't leave them alone. It was late at night when something slid quietly under the front door. At first, no one noticed because they were still in the living room and tried to calm down after the strange events of the evening. But then Sarah heard a soft sound, like paper rustling on the floor. Then she stood up and walked to the door. Then she looked down and saw an envelope lying on the floor. It looked old and fancy, with a smooth surface that reflected the dim light. The strange thing was that it looked so clean, even though it had come from outside. But Tom picked it up first, because no one else wanted to touch it.
Who would send us something this late?
Inside, there was a simple note. It said,
"You are invited to a Thanksgiving ritual. Join us at the barn at midnight. The harvest awaits."
Then, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine because she didn't like the words. After all, they sounded wrong. It didn't feel like a normal invitation because it felt more like a warning. Even though she didn't want to go, a strange feeling told her that they had no choice.
I don't think we should go.
Mark said, and
This feels like a trap.
suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and the shadows on the walls moved strangely as if they were alive. Then, a loud wind hit the windows and made them shake. Then, Sarah looked outside and gasped.
There's someone out there.
She whispered and pointed toward the edge of the property. They all ran to the window and they saw a tall figure wearing a dark hood standing just beyond the porch light. It didn't move, but it felt like it was watching them. Then, Tom grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the figure. But as soon as the light touched it, the figure disappeared into the trees and moved faster than they thought possible.
What was that?
Tom asked and his voice was shaky.
I don't know,
Mark said.
but I think we need to find out what's going on.
Even though they were scared, they felt they couldn't ignore the invitation. Because of the strange events, the figure, and the letter, they all seemed connected. If they didn't go, they might never know the truth. With fear in their hearts, they decided to go to the barn. The harvest was waiting, and they didn't know if they would survive. Later they went to the barn, and when they reached there, it felt as though the night had swallowed the entire world. The barn stood in front of them, tall and broken, and it looked like it hadn't been used for many years. Everything around it was quiet. Too quiet. There were no lights and no signs of life. But the air felt heavy, and the smell of damp earth filled their noses. The ground was muddy and slippery as they walked closer. Suddenly, the large wooden door creaked open by itself before anyone could touch it. Then, the sound echoed in the silence and made the group freeze for a moment.
Do we really have to go in there?
Sarah asked and her voice was shaking. She didn't want to take another step because the barn felt so wrong.
We have come this far.
Mark replied.
If we don't go in, we will never know what is happening.
Inside, the barn was bigger than it looked from the outside. In the middle of the room was a long wooden table, and it was set up like a Thanksgiving dinner, with plates, silverware, and cups filled with a dark liquid. At first, it almost looked normal, but then they noticed something strange, because the candles on the table were old and bent, as if they hadn't been touched for years. The air inside the barn felt much colder than outside, like the place was holding its breath.
I don't like this.
Tom said and took a step back. Suddenly, all the candles on the table lit up on their own. The flames were not yellow like normal candles, but an eerie blue, and made everything in the barn glow in an unnatural way.
Did you see that?
Sarah whispered. But before anyone could answer, ghostly figures began to appear around the table. At first, they looked like smoke, but slowly, they became clearer. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, and they didn't move. Suddenly, one of the ghosts, a man in torn clothes, turned his head toward the group. His voice was low and rough. Then he said,
"The feast begins when the harvest ends."
Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut with a loud bang and made everyone jump. The ghostly figures didn't move, but their eyes stared at the group, making the air feel heavier and colder. Then, the table began to shake, and the figures reached out with their hands. It seemed like they were waiting for something, waiting for the harvest to begin. Now, the air inside the barn had been so heavy that it was hard for anyone to breathe. After what felt like hours, surrounded by the ghostly figures, the group finally managed to escape. They ran out of the barn, and their legs were shaking with fear. No one spoke because they were too scared, but their minds were full of questions. When they got back to the house, everything was quiet. Even though they were now inside and the barn was far away, the fear didn't leave them. Then, Mark was the first to speak.
We need answers,
He said, and his voice was trembling. The next morning, the group decided to visit the town library, because they wanted to learn more about what was happening. The library was very small, and most of the books were about farming or the history of the town. However, Sarah noticed a dusty shelf in a dark corner. It was full of old papers and fragile books that looked like they had not been touched for years. Then, she carefully picked up one of the books and began to read. After a few minutes, her face turned pale. "Look at this," she whispered, and showed the others a page about something called the harvest ritual. The group leaned closer as Sarah read aloud. She explained that the ritual was an old tradition in the town that had practiced every 50 years. The people believed it was necessary because it pleased something called the harvest god. Without the ritual, the crops would fail, and the town would suffer. The souls of the chosen are offered to keep the land fertile. Sarah read and her voice was shaking. Mark grabbed the book and shook his head. "This can't be real. It is just an old story," he said, but he didn't sound confident. "But what if it is true?" Sarah asked, and her eyes were wide with fear. "What if we are the chosen ones?" As they read more, they found records of people disappearing every 50 years. Suddenly, Sarah heard a whisper, "You are too late to run." She looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. The whisper grew louder, and the room felt like it was closing in. The truth was now clear because they were part of the harvest. The day after their terrifying visit to the barn, Sarah felt something strange happen because while she was washing her hands, a sudden pain shot through her arm. She winced and pulled back, but she felt a strong heat coming from her skin. Then, she looked down in horror and saw a turkey-shaped mark burned into her forearm. The edges of the mark were dark and glowing with an unnatural heat, as if something had burned her skin with a fire that didn't belong in this world. "Tom," she screamed and held her arm. "Tom, look at this." Then, Tom quickly rushed to her side, and his eyes were full of shock. "What is that? How did it even happen?" Sarah called to explain it. Because the mark was like nothing they had seen before. It wasn't one of the symbols from the books they had read at the library. There was something old and evil about it, and the heat from the mark grew stronger and made Sarah gasp in pain. Just as Tom reached for the first aid kit, Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter. Then, she picked it up and saw a text message. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but the message said, "Prepare for the feast." Her heart raced as she looked up at her friends. Mark, who had been staring at the mark on Sarah's arm, and spoke first. "We are being targeted. This is part of the ritual, and we are marked now." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A chill filled the air, and it sank deep into their bones. Sarah saw something move from the corner of her eye. Then, she turned to the mirror above the fireplace and saw dark shadows flickering inside it. Shadows that didn't belong to anyone in the room. "Did you see that?" she whispered, and her voice was shaking. Before anyone could answer, they heard a sharp noise from the kitchen. It was the sound of a knife scraping against stone, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, sharpening a blade. Then, Tom grabbed a chair, and his hands were shaking. "We need to leave, and we need to get out of here now." But Sarah couldn't move because she couldn't stop staring at the mirror, where the shadowy figures were still moving, their shapes strange and flickering in and out of focus. Suddenly, the whispers began again, soft at first, but then growing louder.
"You are next. You are next for the feast."
The voices said, as if they were coming from everywhere. Then, the mark on Sarah's arm burned hotter and sent sharp pain through her body. She held her arm tightly and tried to stop the spreading heat. But her friends watched in horror as the shadows in the mirror grew darker and more threatening. Sarah whispered and clenched her teeth, "We can't escape because we are already part of this." That night, the wind howled outside the house and shook the windows and doors. The group huddled together, and their nerves grew more tense as the hours passed in silence. The barn, the ritual, the mark on Sarah's arm, it all felt too much to bear. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside. Slow and steady, the footsteps circled the house, the heavy boots scraping the dirt beneath them. Each step grew closer, and each footfall echoed through the floorboards. "Who's out there?" Tom asked quietly, and his hand was shaking as he held a flashlight. "I don't know," Mark replied, and his eyes were wide with fear. "But they are watching us." Then, the group gathered by the windows and looked out into the dark yard, but they couldn't see anything. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and sure, like a predator hunting its prey. Then came the scraping sound, long and drawn out, like claws dragging across the glass. It sent a cold shiver down their spines. Sarah felt her heart race and said, "What could it be? What kind of thing was stalking them so carefully?" "Is it the hunter?" Sarah asked, and her voice was trembling. Now, a new fear filled their minds as they remembered the note left on their door earlier. "Run, little turkeys, the hunter comes at dawn." They didn't know what the hunter was, but they knew it was coming for them. Then, they hurried to barricade the doors and windows and hoped it would stop whatever was outside. But the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder and closer, and the scraping sound continued, like something with unnatural strength trying to break in. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. She could feel it, a presence, something watching them from outside. Now the air inside the house grew heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the whispers began again, but this time louder and clearer, and echoed in her mind.
"You will be carved, and you will be the feast."
The voices whispered. Suddenly, the front door shook, as if something powerful was trying to open it. The group jumped back, and their hearts raced. Then, they pressed against the walls, and were afraid to make a sound, because whatever was out there wasn't human. Now, the air seemed to grow thicker, and the house creaked under the weight of the footsteps outside. Then, a deep and growling sound came from the dark. "Do you hear that?" Mark whispered, and his voice was shaking. Before anyone could respond, the growl turned into a low and disturbing chuckle. The hunter was getting closer, and they were running out of time. In the early hours of the morning, the group knew they had no choice. They couldn't stay in the house any longer, not with the hunter still circling outside. Then they grabbed what they could, flashlights and a few supplies, and then headed toward the dense forest behind the house. The trees towered over them, and their twisted branches stretched out like skeleton hands, casting creepy shadows in the pale light. The path ahead was hard to see, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under their feet. But as they moved deeper into the forest, something strange started to happen, because they began to hear whispers. They were soft and melodic, but there was something dark about them. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah couldn't tell if the whispers were real or if fear was making them imagine things. But each whisper seemed to pull them in different directions and lead them deeper into the woods. "This way," Sarah whispered and tried to follow the voices. But something felt wrong, because the whispers were calling them toward something. But it didn't feel like a safe place. It felt like a trap. "Don't listen," Tom said quietly and grabbed Sarah's arm. "They are trying to trick us. We need to get out of here." Suddenly, they heard a loud scream from a far distance, and they rushed to the place where they heard the loud scream. Later, the scream is getting louder and louder. Suddenly, they saw the barn appear in the distance, and its broken shape barely seen against the dark sky. They moved slowly, and their hearts were pounding faster with every step. When they reached the barn, the heavy wooden door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, and the sound echoed in the quiet like a warning. Then, what they saw inside was worse than any nightmare. Tied to the ceremonial table was a young girl, Lily, from the same township. She was unconscious and tightly bound with thick ropes. Blood covered the table around her, but none of it seemed to be her. But she was still alive, just barely. Then, a low and deep chant came from the corners of the barn. They saw hooded figures standing in a circle around the table, and moving together in a strange way, as if they were all following the same rhythm. They spoke words that made no sense, but the air felt thick and full of power. One of the cultists turned toward them, and their eyes were empty and cold.
"The harvest god calls for your offering,"
they hissed. Then, the friends stood frozen in fear, and they were unable to move because of the horrifying scene. Suddenly the ground under them shook, and the candlelight flickered wildly, throwing long and dark shadows across the walls. Then, a terrible roar filled the barn, an inhuman and monstrous sound that shook them to the bone. The harvest god, whatever it was waking up. Then, they saw a huge figure begin to form in the shadows. It was something ancient and terrifying, and its shape was shifting and twisting. Then, its glowing eyes fixed on them, and they felt a deep and primal fear growing inside them. The creature's mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, a sickening energy filled the air, heavy and suffocating. The ritual had started, and there was no way to stop it now. The room smelled horrible, like something was rotting, and the feeling of fear was heavy in the air. But in the middle of all the chaos, something else caught their attention. A strange and glowing object on the altar. It was a cornucopia, but not like the ones they knew. This one looked twisted and unnatural, a dark version of the harvest symbol. The horn-shaped object glowed with an eerie, golden light, and as they got closer, the air around it seemed to move, like it was alive. Inside the cornucopia, they saw swirling, twisted faces souls trapped inside. Their eyes begged for help, and their mouths were open in silent screams. Sarah reached out, her hand shaking. "What is this?" she whispered. "What's happening to them?" Mark stepped forward, his face pale. It is the source of their power. The cult's power. These souls, they are the sacrifice. And the cornucopia keeps them locked inside and feeding the harvest god." They understood now. The cornucopia wasn't just an object. It was a prison for the souls of past victims. Their suffering made the ritual stronger and gave the cult its power. And now, by getting so close, they were part of that cycle. Suddenly, Sarah felt sick to her stomach. She turned to look at Lily, and she was still strapped to the table. But her body began to move, twitching, and her skin stretched and twisted like something inside her was trying to break free. Her mouth opened into a terrible grin, and her eyes snapped open, showing only darkness. Now she was changing, and the ritual was almost finished. Suddenly a deep and horrible growl came from Lily's throat, but it wasn't her voice. "You should have stayed away." As they watched in terror, they knew there was no way out. The harvest god had claimed Lily as its vessel, and the transformation had already begun. Now the barn, which had once been silent and still, had turned into a battleground. As the group tried to destroy the cornucopia, the air was filled with something dark and terrible. A strong sense of fear hung around them and made every movement feel slow, like they were walking through thick fog. The air smelled like blood and fear and made it hard to breathe. Sarah's heart raced as she swung a rusty crowbar at the nearest cultist. But the cultist didn't move. It didn't even seem human. Instead, it smiled at her, and its face was too wide and its eyes too dark. Sarah took a step back and felt sick to her stomach. "You think you can stop the harvest?" The cultist hissed. Its voice sounded like nails scratching a chalkboard. Suddenly, A loud and terrifying cry came from the shadows. Lily, still under the control of the harvest god, charged at them. Her eyes were wild and unrecognizable, and her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Her body twisted and stretched, like a puppet with broken strings. "Lily!" Mark shouted, but his voice was lost in the awful screeching that filled the barn. Before they could move, the ceiling cracked open, and blood poured down, soaking the ground and covering their feet. Now the barn had become a nightmare, but they couldn't stop because the ritual was almost done. In a panic, Mark pushed the others toward the cornucopia. "We need to destroy it, now." His voice shook with fear. But as he moved, a sharp pain burned in his chest, because a mark had been seared into his skin, the final part of the ritual. With a shout, Mark tore the cornucopia from its place and threw it into the flames. But before the fire could burn it completely, something shifted because the harvest god was waking up. But it wasn't just a god. It was something worse, something that hungered for more. The barn shook violently as a horrible smell filled the air. The ground groaned beneath their feet, and then they heard it. A loud, terrifying roar, ancient and powerful, that made them feel like their very bones were shaking. From the shadows came a giant and monstrous figure, looking like a huge turkey, but much worse. Its feathers were torn and falling off, like dead leaves, and its glowing yellow eyes burned with hunger. Mark barely managed to whisper, "This can't be real." The harvest god's eyes locked onto them, and time seemed to stop. Each of them was hit with visions of their worst fears. For Sarah, it was a storm of memories from her childhood, painful and suffocating. The god's eyes seemed to reach into their souls and pull out their deepest hurts. The barn was full of whispers, faint at first, but they grew louder and louder. "You are already part of the feast." The words dug into their minds and made it hard to think. The barn itself seemed to change, the walls bending and the shadows moving, as if reality was falling apart. Then, like a puppet on strings, Lily began to move forward. Her body jerked strangely, and the harvest god's voice echoed in her mind, "Serve me." The barn was falling apart, and the harvest god's screeches filled the air as the ground shook with its fury. The ritual wasn't over, but it was too late to stop it now. The friends were on the edge, and each lost in their own nightmares. The walls bled, and the air was thick with the scent of decay, like the town had died long ago, and the barn was its tomb. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Mark's voice cut through the madness. Holding his chest in pain, his eyes met Sarah's with understanding. "You have to end it," he whispered. "You have to kill me, because the ritual can't stop without the final offering." The others recoiled, but Mark's body twisted grotesquely. "I am the final piece," he said, and his voice was distorted. "I am the offering." With a cry of anguish, Sarah stepped forward, a knife in hand. Mark's eyes were filled with tears, but he had already accepted his sacrifice. With one swift motion, she drove the knife into his chest. Then, the harvest god howled in rage as the barn began to crumble. Flames erupted from the cornucopia and burned the darkness away. The group ran and looked back as the barn exploded in a blinding flash. The harvest god was gone, and the ritual was finished. But the terror they had endured would haunt them forever, and some wounds would never heal. The survivors returned to town in silence, their minds fractured from the nightmare they had endured. Everything seemed disturbingly normal: sun shining, shops open, life continuing, as though nothing had happened. But to Sarah and the others, the town felt wrong, as though it was holding its breath. Sarah stared out the car window, her hands trembling from the memory of Mark's last moments. Something had followed them home. She could feel it as they walked to their homes. Unease settled over them. Each step felt heavier, and the sense of being watched grew unbearable. Then Sarah noticed it. On her arm, beneath her sleeve, was a small scar. Turkey-shaped, faint but unmistakable. Her breath caught, She rubbed it, hoping it was an illusion, but it didn't fade. The others saw similar marks on their skin, each in the same ominous shape. "What does this mean?" Tom whispered, his voice barely steady as he touched the scar on his neck. "It's not over," Sarah murmured, dread rising in her chest. "It's still with us." They tried to resume normal life, but whispers seemed to float on the wind. At night, just out of reach, but always present, the scars burned, a grim reminder of the horrors they survived. One evening, they met at the edge of town, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. As they stared into the distance, a faint voice drifted through the air, until the next harvest. A chill ran through them, freezing their breath. The scars throbbed. They knew then the harvest god wasn't gone. It was waiting, and their town would never be the same. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.